Tell us about cases in your life when you suddenly realized that it was high time to get out of there. This didn't happen to me, but to my friend. She was about to hop on a tram when she suddenly felt, as she put it, like Big Boss upstairs, she's Muslim, was telling her to skip that one and wait for the next. She texted me to say she'd be late for class. I wasn't planning to go to college that day anyway. I wasn't feeling well. 2 hours later, my dad called. He and the rest of my family were safe, but he said there had been a terrorist attack in the city. Someone had taken 4 lives on a tram. It was the exact tram my friend decided not to board. She caught the next one instead and later had to run for safety. Around 2009, I was 19 and in college when someone messaged me on Facebook saying they'd found my ID. They gave me an address and said I could come pick it up. When I arrived, the front door was slightly open and the only light inside came from a TV flickering in the living room. I called out, "Hey, I'm here for my ID." Silence. Being young and not so wise, I started to push the door open, but then it hit me how mega suspicious the whole scene was. I bolted. Back home, I messaged the person explaining I'd come by and described what happened. Never got a reply. Luckily, that ID had my parents' address on it and they lived in another city. One night there was some chaos at a bar. Some random dude shoved another guy and I instantly grabbed my friends and yanked them out of there, pronto. Shootouts weren't unusual in that area and the place itself was so cramped there was basically nowhere to hide if things went kaboom. Everyone bailed. Nothing bad happened that night, but the very next evening, one of the groups started spraying the place with pew-pew energy. One person didn't make it and a few others got injured. It turned out to be the biggest no-thank-you firefight of that summer. We later gathered at a friend's house to talk it over. At first, they said I'd overreacted by dragging everyone out, but the next night they apologized. In 2010, I had just returned home and was looking for work. I was temporarily staying with my grandmother and uncle. One morning, they gave me a ride into town for a job interview and then went shopping. The weather was nice and I was walking half asleep, lost in thought. When I got to the place, it was closed. I knocked and a woman came out, her voice trembling. "There's some psycho with a gun shooting people here." She looked terrified and all I could picture were my grandmother and uncle wandering nearby. I immediately started looking for them and only then noticed that the surrounding shops were completely empty, which I hadn't realized before. It turned out we had arrived about half an hour after the shooter had left. The moment I understood what was happening, my eyes nearly popped out of my head. This happened in the UK, where shootings like this are extremely rare. Eternal rest to the victims of Deck Bird. Once a friend invited me to a party, someone I really wanted to impress. She picked me up and we headed to the place. But the moment we stepped into the living room, I realized it wasn't a normal party at all. On the couches, 2 white gang-style dudes with shaved heads and tattoos were chillin', sipping beer with honey, weed, and more beer spread out on the table. Besides them, there was my friend who'd brought me, a 9-year-old boy in dirty clothes, and me. Apparently she'd just dragged me along because she didn't want to go alone and decided to use me as a bodyguard, without warning me. I sat on the chair for a few minutes, thinking whether it'd be smarter and safer to just turn around and leave or pretend to hang out. I nodded along, acting like I was listening, for about 5 minutes. Then the kid walked up and told me he wished his parents would come home because his uncle always acted like this. I went to the kitchen, peeked into the yard, and by pure chance, I saw 2 police patrols driving down the neighboring street. I quietly slipped out the back door, crossed the yard, climbed over the fence, and ran through alleys until I made it home. It took about half an hour on foot. 2 days later, I found out everyone in that house had been arrested and the boy was taken into custody. I never spoke to that girl again. It was the dumbest and most dangerous situation of my life. Since then, almost 20 years now, I never get into someone else's car. I always drive my own, so I can bail anytime. Around 3 a.m., I was leaving a friend's apartment. To get out of the complex, I had to walk down a long corridor and then cross the street to reach my car. About a third of the way, I felt someone behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a guy in a hoodie at the start of the corridor. I picked up the pace, so did he. Halfway down, I spun around and he froze for a second, then started running. I bolted too, sprinting as fast as I could. I reached the gates, ran to my car, and he was already right at the door. Then out of nowhere, a car turned the corner. The headlights hit both of us. He glanced at the light and I slammed the gas and sped away. In 2002, I was at the Lug and River Run Festival sitting at a slot machine in the Harris Casino. A few members of the hellish biker crew walked in and I told my friend, "Grab your cash, we're bouncing. There are angels here." He stared at me like, "Dude, what?" But I just hit the button on his slot, grabbed him, and dragged him toward the exit. We walked right past a couple of bikers and just as we reached the river, a shootout broke out inside the casino. This was one of those times when I wanted to leave immediately but couldn't do it fast enough. In 2008, I lived for several months in a social housing unit. On the lease, it was just me and a friend. We were around 21, but all sorts of teenagers were constantly crashing there, some as young as 15, sleeping on mattresses on the floor. I kept my room locked and in decent shape, but the rest of the apartment looked like a den. Mattresses on the floor, a pile of dirty dishes in the sink, beer bottles in the fridge, and deep dents on the front door, painted over. Apparently someone had tried to break in. People were constantly coming and going, mostly locals who'd lived in the neighborhood all their lives. If the neighbors saw a party, or even sometimes if they didn't, they just walked in, and you couldn't risk kicking them out. Once, a random guy showed up among the 10 guests we actually invited. He fiddled with an old boombox for over an hour. I was sure he wanted to steal it, though in the end, nobody took anything. Cops often came by. The building's security almost lived there, and if they couldn't handle it, they called the police. The officers would kick everyone out and leave, rarely arresting anyone. I'm pretty sure the reason no one got booked was that most of us were white. We 100% deserved it, especially me, an adult living in a den with minors where everyone drank and smoked all sorts of stuff. One friend even came over once and said, "Is this your grandpa's house?" Because we sometimes had runaway teens living there for weeks. I shrugged, knowing it wouldn't last long, but I lived by the principle, live in the moment. The house was right across from my college. One evening I stepped outside for a smoke, though honestly everyone smoked inside anyway. As I stood thinking, someone called me from the left. A staircase led to the second floor landing of the neighboring building. An old lady, probably 70, though she could have been 90, beckoned me over. She asked me to sit. My gut usually screamed danger in that area, but it was silent this time, so I took a puff from my Camel and sat. God bless that woman. She looked at me with a stern, parent-like gaze and said something I'll never forget. "You realize everyone here is watching you. Your names are on everyone's lips. You are in the spotlight, and this is the last place you want to be in the center of attention. If things continue as they are, something very, very bad will happen in your apartment. You need to leave as soon as possible." I told her I would, and I did. Within a couple of weeks, I had moved out. Later, I heard from a friend, then read in the news. Shortly after I left, a fight broke out in the neighboring apartment over a missing fizzy magic beanbag, and people pulled boomsticks. Several people died, including innocent bystanders. I shivered thinking about how close it all could have happened to me. I will never forget my time there, nor the sober, caring warning from a stranger, a woman whose name I never even learned. I had moved to New York, traveled a lot, but was still a pretty naive girl. My parents had been overprotective, so I hadn't learned how sketchy some situations could get. I met a girl on the ferry, sweet but a bit off. Now I realized she was probably under something. After a minute of talking, she found out I wasn't from New York and didn't have family there. Then her friend, a good-looking, well-dressed guy, came over. From that moment, she didn't say a word. He sat next to me, she sat across, and I got this icy gut feeling, hair standing on end. He started complimenting me, and my alarm bells went off immediately. I looked like a simple tomboy from Wisconsin, very polite and innocent. Technically, they weren't doing anything wrong, so the conversation continued, but every fiber of my being wanted to leave. Impossible on a moving ferry. He kept leaning closer and invited me to a party after the ferry. I tried to politely decline, but I had zero experience with these situations. Stupidly, I gave him my number, super naive and dumb. They hovered over me until I agreed. He immediately checked the number by calling it. I did manage to say I didn't know where I lived yet, since I had just moved. When we docked, I stayed near a ferry worker and pretended to call a friend while another staff member was nearby, just to make sure I wasn't alone while they tried to convince me to go with them. That guy called me a few more times, trying to sweet-talk me, then eventually started yelling and insulting me, demanding I answer. Over time, with experience and eventually becoming a nurse, I realized how dangerous that situation could have been. I'm definitely going to teach my daughter how to recognize these red flags and shut them down immediately. Somewhere in the middle of who knows where, Wyoming, my wife was helping with the dinosaur dig, and I took our two younger kids, 4 and 6, for a hike in the mountains. Not far from the cars, we climbed the tallest little hill in the area and stopped to snap a few pics. That's when I noticed the hair on both my son and daughter standing straight up. One of my favorite photos ever is of my daughter pointing and laughing at her brother's wild static hair, while hers was sticking up the same way. And then it hit me. Decades ago, I'd read a comic in Boy's Life explaining that if your hair suddenly does that in the mountains, it means lightning is about to strike nearby. I shoved my phone in my pocket, grabbed the kids, and bolted downhill like a caffeinated squirrel. We reached the cars just as a storm rolled in, slamming us with rain while we scrambled inside. It could have ended 1,000 times worse. This happened earlier this year. I went out for a walk when suddenly I felt dizzy and nauseous. My breathing got weird and I even dropped to my knees. Then something deep inside me started yelling on repeat, "Go home, right now." I headed back, and as soon as I stepped into my room, I saw I'd forgotten to blow out a candle. It had tipped over, set something on fire, and even made one of my favorite glass dishes explode. I grabbed a blanket, smothered the flames, and thankfully everything turned out fine. Only the blanket was toast and the dish shattered, but still, yikes. After that, I became even more careful than before. And yes, after putting out the fire, I felt totally fine, no dizziness, no nausea, no spooky vibes. I went for another walk and everything was calm. One time, a friend and I finished a climb in Estes Park, Colorado, and made it to the summit. We saw a massive wall of storm clouds rapidly approaching. My friend, calm as ever, was coiling the rope and packing gear into anchors while lightning was literally tearing across the sky. I, swearing like a sailor, told him we needed to put the gear aside and move fast. At some point, he finally realized how screwed we were, and we shoved everything into our backpacks and bolted down the mountain as fast as we could. He was usually a super meticulous climber, which is great most of the time, but sometimes he really needed a shake-up to realize danger was real. Halloween 1989. My ex-wife and I went to Hollywood just for fun, to people watch, show off a bit, the usual. The crowd was insane. Streets were blocked and mounted police were patrolling the area. We wandered around for about an hour when suddenly I saw someone throw a bottle from the crowd, hitting a police officer. I grabbed my wife and said, "We need to bounce." We parked nearby on a side street, got to the car, and drove away just before the riots began. Later, I ran into a 24-hour store for some beer. By then, I'd had a few drinks, but my sober brother was driving. Inside, two shady-looking guys gave off a very bad vibe. Even in my state, I knew something was off. I grabbed what I wanted, paid quickly, and left. I got in the car and told my brother, "Let's go. Fast." About 5 minutes later, we heard sirens. The police were rushing to that store. It had just been robbed at gunpoint. This happened ages ago. I went to Indonesia on a work trip instead of my Aussie cousin, who owned a small company making outdoor gear. Right after leaving the airport in a rental car, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had no idea there was a revolution going on. People were literally fighting in the streets. The airline had just dropped us off at the airport with zero info, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. My spidey sense kicked in, so I told the driver to skip the address the company gave me and head straight to the nearest fancy pants hotel. 30 seconds later, we saw burning tires in the road and folks dragging people out of their cars. The driver pulled a wild combat turn on our little Mercedes. Felt like we were in a video game. I nearly blacked out from the G-force or from smashing my face against the window. I tipped the driver $50. In the hotel, I ended up falling asleep in the bathtub while tracer rounds whizzed and boom booms echoed through the city. I was on an exchange program in Germany, and our little trio of girlfriends was tight. One of us, let's call her Laura, started flirting with two guys from Ghana we met near the Glockenspiel in Munich. My other friend, Carrie, and I were wrapped up in our own messy ex-relationships back in the US and weren't planning on dating anyone. But we agreed to be support for Laura. Laura invited the guys to meet the next day at 7 p.m. by the Glockenspiel. She was excited, and Carrie and I agreed to go along. The next evening, the guys were already waiting. We met and decided to go to a nearby bar. We took off our coats and sat down, but there weren't enough seats. One of the guys jokingly suggested I sit on his lap. I refused, but he kept coaxing me. "Come on, I don't bite." I felt like I looked tense and unfriendly, which wasn't helping Laura at all, so I agreed. I thought nothing bad will happen. Laura was chatting animatedly with the second guy. The guys offered drinks, Laura and Carrie ordered, and I said I didn't want one. Carrie kept ordering more and more, clearly trying to milk the guys, even though she wasn't actually interested. It made me uncomfortable. It felt dishonest, and I worried the guys might expect something in return. At one point, Laura's guy said to mine, "I'm heading to the ATM." I sensed he wasn't thrilled about the situation, and my unease grew even more because Laura and Carrie were draining the guys' budgets. While they went to talk privately, I was still on the lap of the other guy. Soon the one who went to the ATM came back and bought Carrie another drink. Laura said enough drinking. A little later, they started kissing, and the guy whose lap I was on tried to kiss me and go under my clothes. I repeatedly pushed his hand away and said no, but he ignored me. Red flags were flashing in my mind. He wasn't respecting boundaries. I decided it was time to leave. I told Carrie I needed to use the restroom, and she offered to come with me. Once inside, she said, "I'll grab Laura, you get our coats." I felt relief realizing she felt the same. Time to bounce. I worried Laura might resist, but we left the restroom, grabbed the coats, and the guy who had gone to the ATM looked at us disapprovingly and asked, "What are you doing?" I didn't answer and bolted outside. Seconds later, Laura and Carrie ran out behind me, with the guys chasing them. We sprinted to the nearby train station. Once we got down, they were gone, but I stayed alert, expecting them to show up. Laura dryly said something like, Next time, remind me not to meet random guys off the street. The train came, the guys never showed, and we got away safely. Looking back, I think they may have just seen us as girls trying to score free drinks. To some extent, Carrie had been doing exactly that. After that, I almost completely stopped accepting drinks from strangers, only taking them from a boyfriend or close friend when trading rounds. It's obvious a drink doesn't obligate anything, but some people might interpret it very differently in their heads. I was sitting one evening in the parking lot near my then boyfriend's place. We were chilling and sharing a happy pancake. You know what I mean. He had just bought a used BMW in great condition. In a nearby apartment complex lived some locally famous troublemakers who used to hang out with, but later cut off because of their lifestyle. One of them owned the exact same BMW model as my boyfriend, except it was black. My boyfriend's car was a lighter color, but at night it looked pretty much the same. Out of nowhere, I got this creepy gut feeling and said, "Let's bounce." He waved me off. I asked again, then again, and finally I flat out yelled, "Drive, fluffernutter, right now, I'm serious." He reluctantly pulled away. Just 4 parking spots down, we saw someone sneaking between the cars. To leave the complex, we had to drive past him. The guy was holding what looked like a short pew-pew stick. After we sped out, my boyfriend called some of his old acquaintances to ask what the heck was going on. Turned out that dude almost mistook us for one of those local hooligans. People had already tried to mess him up several times because of his shady business. My boyfriend sold the car less than a week later. Back in my freshman year, a friend and I went to a house party off campus. Everything seemed normal: drinks, flirting, fun little antics. We knew the place, the hosts, and almost everyone there. But suddenly I got this weird gut feeling. I picked around a corner and saw a guy standing in the kitchen, completely naked. I shot my friend a meaningful look and let her out through another door. Later I found out that shortly after we left, the party turned into a full-blown chaotic situation and everyone there ended up with an STD. No judgment, I just really didn't want any part of that and was glad we left. Thanks so much for watching. Share your own gut feeling to bail stories in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos. See you next time.